Chapter 6. Wednesday. Jordan stared at the woman across from her and waited for the vision to come. It never took this long, but then again her visions had been different the last few days. And this morning, for the first time in months, she'd received nothing. She'd forgotten what silence was after months of visions every morning, and she'd stayed on her knees an extra 20 minutes, which was ridiculous because it wasn't like God was late. So what was going on? Actually, it had been silent since the vision of the baby yesterday, which only deepened her concern that the baby was her son. If these visions were like the ones that drove her to find Kat, they would not go away until she went to find her son. But what if she was wrong? She had just started this job, and Micah had told Kat they had work to do here. What if she was just hoping the baby was her son so she had an excuse to go see him? "Excuse me, aren't you supposed to show me pamphlets or something?" Jordan blinked and returned her focus to the girl across from her. She was young, probably under 17. Maybe she'd received nothing because the girl had nothing to hide. But that made no sense because she was pregnant. And Jordan doubted she would be here if she weren't afraid of what her parents would say when they found out. "Right." Jordan grabbed the stack that sat next to her computer. "Do you know how far along you are?" The girl shook her head, and from the twist of her mouth, Jordan was fairly certain she was biting the inside of her lip as she did. "Not that far. I'm 3 weeks late, and I took the test a few days ago." The girl's hands lay in her lap, but they were not still, clasping and unclasping with nervous energy. "Okay, well, we offer testing and ultrasounds here. We'd start with a urine test to be positive. Ultrasounds are usually scheduled about week 10 or 12. It's hard to see much before then." The girl's mouth fell open. "You can see the baby at 12 weeks?" Jordan smiled, but it always surprised her how little these women seemed to understand about fetal development. Had they never learned this in school? "To be fair, the baby looks a lot like a kidney bean on the ultrasound, but it's definitely a baby with fingers, toes, and a heartbeat." All color faded from the girl's face, and her hand snaked up to tug on her collar as if it had suddenly become too tight. "I don't think I can raise a baby. I'm only 16. "I completely understand, but that's why there's adoption. There are so many people out there who are unable to have children of their own, and they would love to adopt your baby. In some cases, they even pay for all the medical care." "Adoption? You mean give the baby up? How could I do that?" It never ceased to amaze Jordan how women could rationalize that it was better to kill their baby than give them life and let someone love on him or her. It's hard, but it's so much better than the alternative. The girl stopped tugging on her collar and focused on Jordan. "You gave your baby up for adoption?" "I did, back in Texas. I was like you, young and unable to care for a baby. So I found an amazing couple and gave him to them. You could do the same." "But don't you miss him?" The girl's voice was quiet, pinched. "Every day," Jordan said. "But at least I know he's alive and he has a chance to have a wonderful life." Except he didn't. Jordan knew that now. With the rapture imminent, he would never get to grow up. Was that what was bothering her? Was that why her visions were focused on this baby? Because she was too obsessed with her own son and how little of life he would get to live? She supposed it was possible, but racing off to Texas to make sure he was okay seemed silly. Still, something was definitely going on with her. The question was, what was she supposed to do about it? Kat hoisted her bag higher on her shoulder as she pulled open the glass door to the gym. A month ago, she would never have believed she would have enjoyed spending an hour in a giant padded room, punching a bag and sweating like a linebacker. But there was something freeing in the workout. The ability to let out all of her frustrations was satisfying, and even though she was now dealing with Stella's death better, she had even more frustrations with this new task and her suspension. She was going stir-crazy sitting at home. But it was easier than what she knew she should be doing. Getting out and sharing her faith with people. She'd always found it hard to share about her faith, especially with those she didn't know. But now the stakes felt much higher and the pressure was heavy. This hour allowed her to escape it for a short moment in time, at least when she wasn't seeing lights over the people in the gym. "Hey, how are you enjoying the gym?" The gravelly voice pulled her from her thoughts, and she looked up to see Brian, the owner of the gym, staring at her from behind his desk. His sleeveless t-shirt showed off his muscular arms, and though she couldn't currently see his legs, she knew he would be sporting a pair of tights under shorts. But it wasn't his outfit that caught her attention. It was the light behind him. Great, she needed to talk to him now? Though she couldn't be certain, Kat didn't think he'd had a light any other time she'd been in the gym. Was Micah trying to take everything away from her? She couldn't lose the gym as well as her job. It was her place of sanity. She'd gone crazy this morning just sitting around the house after Jordan left for work. "It's good. I'm really enjoying it." "Good. It's Kate, right?" She smiled slightly. That was a mistake she received often, but she couldn't fault him. Other than the few minutes they had chatted when she signed her contract, this was the longest conversation she'd had with him. He was usually working with the more advanced people, like Raven. "It's Kat, actually." "Kat. Right. Sorry. Well, I'm glad you're here." He smiled at her, but something in his expression told her he wasn't quite done with the conversation yet. Thanks?" She considered him a moment as she thought of how best to approach the subject. He was someone she was supposed to talk to, but she knew so little about him. How was she supposed to start a conversation about his faith when she didn't even know if he had a family? "Can I ask you a question?" He seemed as surprised by his question as she was, but Kat recovered first, smiling and nodding. This had to be her cue. She placed her bag on the floor and sat on one of the chairs across from his desk. "What can I do for you?" He took a deep breath, then his eyes shifted to the desk and then out the window. Traffic flowed steadily by on the busy street out the window, and a few pedestrians strolled the sidewalk. But Kat knew the view wasn't why his gaze was focused that direction. He was gathering the courage to speak, so Kat waited patiently. "I've heard a little about the conversations you've had with some of the members here." Uh-oh. Was he about to tell her she couldn't talk to people about their faith? He didn't seem like the type to lay down conditions like that. But she knew that a lot of people in the gym didn't believe like she did, and even those who claimed to didn't always act like it. Maybe someone had complained. "I wanted to ask if you're a believer, a Christian," he continued. Oh dear, this could go one of two ways. Either it would open the door for them to have an open conversation, or her answer would earn her the same fiery reception it had from her boss. Kat took a deep breath and hoped it was the former. "I am. I guess I've always been, but I hadn't been a very good one until recently after my friend's death." His eyes shot to hers, an intensity flowing out of them like she'd never seen before. "That's what I wanted to ask you about. Why does God let bad things happen?" His question cut to her heart. It was one she had asked herself so many times, and she still wasn't sure she had the right answer. "I mean, I believe in God. When I look around at this world, I find it hard to believe someone didn't create it. But I'm having a hard time wanting to follow him. If he is so good and loving, then why does he allow bad things to happen to people?" Kat sent up a silent prayer for the right words and took a deep breath before answering. "Well, the first thing we have to remember is that God gives us free will. He hopes that we will make the right decisions, the ones that honor him, but he gives us the choice to do otherwise. Some of our pain and hurt comes from making those poor decisions." Brian nodded and drummed his fingers on the desk. "I understand that, but I'm talking about other things not based on our choices. For instance, there was a fighter who trained here, who served in the military, and who has a young daughter he adores. He's not even 24, and I just found out he has a rare form of cancer and probably won't see the end of the year. And last Christmas, my dog died on Christmas Day with my whole family watching. Maybe that sounds silly, but we loved that dog, and his death was unexpected. Why does God allow those things to happen?" Wow, he certainly knew how to cut right to the point. Kat wished she had asked Micah that question because she certainly didn't have the answer. Perhaps Micah would have more knowledge on the subject than she did. If she ever saw him again, it would be her first question. "Have you read the Bible, Brian?" A look of chagrin covered his face, and his gaze dropped to his hands. Some, but probably not as much as I should. Me neither. But I'm thinking about the book of Job. Do you know the story? Is that the guy who had all the bad things happen to him? Kat nodded. It is. See, God isn't the only supernatural being in this world. There are also angels and demons and Satan. The Bible says that in the new heaven, there will be no more pain and suffering because Satan and the demons will be thrown into the lake of fire. But until then, I believe these bad things are Satan's hands. He is crafty and cunning, and he tries to separate us from God any way he can. If the death of your dog and your fighter getting sick has caused you to doubt God, then he has succeeded. Brian ran his hand across his chin, the stubble scraping against his hand and making a soft scratching sound. I guess I never thought about it like that. But why allow Satan to influence us at all? Because God wants to know we choose him because we want to. If everything were rosy all the time, do you think people would come to God, or would they forget about him and settle into complacency? The squeak of unoiled metal filled the air as Brian leaned back in his chair. He folded his arms across his chest and inhaled deeply. Kat wished she could see what was going through his mind, but she knew he had to be working over her response, mulling it over. Suddenly, the light behind him grew brighter. Kat resisted the urge to shield her eyes, but was forced to turn her head. She hoped he wouldn't notice and ask why. Sharing her faith was one thing, but explaining to people that she saw angels was a whole other issue. As quickly as the light had grown bright, it dimmed. Not gone, but definitely not as bright as before. Thank you, Kat. You've opened my eyes to things I hadn't thought of before. I think I can finally start praying again. Was that why his light had dimmed? Had he made the ultimate decision, or had he just gotten a step closer? Would his light disappear when he actually accepted? Again, she wished Micah had given her more of a roadmap. She felt like she was navigating in the dark. You're welcome. As the silence stretched out between them, Kat knew that was her cue, that the conversation was over. For now, at least. Well, I guess I'm going to get changed for class, she said as she stood and threw her bag over her shoulder. He glanced up at the clock. Yep, it's about that time. Thanks again, Kat. She nodded and continued to the locker room. Could she count that as a win? Micah had said the angels were protecting those who were close to making a decision, so maybe they left to protect someone else after the decision was made? Or maybe they were watching over several people, and the brightness determined the amount of attention they needed. Maybe Brian's light had faded because he needed less attention now. There was just so much she still didn't know, and it weighed on her. Raven stared at the clock and willed her boss to speak faster. If they didn't finish this meeting soon, she would miss the 4:00 class at the gym. It was her favorite hour to go, and missing it always threw her routine off. Plus, she got cranky when she was forced to skip a workout. Are there any questions? Finally. That was usually the line said right before the meeting ended. Raven silently willed everyone in the room to keep their mouths shut. Most of her coworkers were like herself, quiet and focused on doing the job and going home. But a few of them were overachievers, and occasionally they would hijack meetings with their inane questions for an additional half an hour or more. Her eyes found Betty, the worst offender, and she glared at the woman. If her hand went into the air, Raven just might lose it on her. Betty's arm twitched as if it was going to lift, and then she turned slightly and her eyes met Raven's. All color faded from her face, and her hands dropped to her lap. Okay, you're all dismissed then. Have a good night, and I'll see you tomorrow. Yes. Raven pushed back her chair and grabbed her bag. A glance at her watch revealed she'd have just enough time to make class if traffic was light. But before she reached the doorway, a chill raced down her spine. Someone was watching her. Again. She turned to see who it was and nearly screamed. Black shadows flitted around the room. Though formless and faceless, they terrified her nonetheless, and her hand flew to her mouth. Raven, you okay? She blinked, and the shapes were gone. Raven? Raven looked at the hand on her arm and up to the face of the man who owned it. Justin. She thought his name was Justin. He wasn't her type, so she hadn't bothered to commit his name to memory, but that felt right. What? He dropped his hand from her arm, but the concern didn't leave his eyes. Are you okay? You look like you'd seen a ghost there for a minute. Had she seen a ghost? She wasn't sure she believed in them, but everything she'd ever seen or read depicted them as white shapes, not black. So what had she seen? Probably nothing. More than likely, she was hallucinating from lack of sleep. Perhaps she needed to up the dose of her sleeping pills so she could finally get some decent rest. I'm fine, she said when she realized she hadn't answered Justin's question. Just thought I saw something, but it was nothing. Okay, if you're sure. He did not look convinced, but she knew he wouldn't press it. That was one of the benefits of her abrasive nature. She kept people far enough away that they might show concern, but they certainly weren't going to waste any sleep over her welfare. I'm sure. She tightened her grip on her bag and looked behind her one last time. No dark shapes, but she had to get a decent night's sleep tonight before she lost her mind. She hurried out of the building and to her car, throwing her bag on the seat beside her and firing up the engine in one swift motion. Raven pulled into the gym parking lot right at 4 o'clock. She hated being late, but thankfully there was always a few minutes of warm-up. Loosening muscles before working out was important, and she hated missing the stretching, but as long as she made it to class, that was all that mattered. Hitting things was her release, her way to channel the anger that continually coursed through her veins. Raven, you in? Brian asked as she passed his desk. Yeah, sorry, work ran late. Give me 5 minutes to get changed. He nodded and Raven continued to the locker room. Her eyes narrowed as she passed Kat running around the bags. The girl offered her a tentative smile, but Raven was in no mood. Cutting it close today, are we? Jason stood at the locker room door, a teasing smile on his face. Yeah, but I'm here. She stepped close enough to touch him and let her arm brush against his, enjoying the way his gaze dropped to the collision of skin. See you in a minute. She wiggled her eyebrows suggestively at him before continuing into the small locker room. Once inside the stall, she pulled her work clothes off and quickly donned her workout gear. Then she grabbed her wraps, gloves, and hair tie and rejoined the main room. She had just finished placing the last clip in her hair to secure her dark locks when another dark shape flew across the room. A small scream escaped her mouth as she turned to see the shape hover near Jason and then disappear. Are you okay? Jordan turned to see Kat staring intently at her. Though she wasn't sure she was okay, Kat was the last person she wanted to talk to about this. I'm fine. She grabbed her gloves and wraps and walked away from Kat before she could ask any further questions. But she was clearly not okay.